Robbie,
Hi, how are you, Ken?
I'm okay.
Good.
Is-
I'm hoping that Elisa and Terry will show up if they are able to. I have specifically written to them that their inputs would be valuable. But if they do show up, we can give some preference to my track. Otherwise, you can do with the whatever you have planned.
I'm just giving a brief kind of summary.
Yes.
Um,
I have a couple of points I can show or I can read,
sure.
but mostly from what we have already covered. So, next week, sometime, I will call you to discuss other things. How did since it is being recorded, I'll be careful. How did the banquet go?
Banquet? Oh, it's
Ah,
very successful.
good, good.
Yeah, it was
I was
very
not, I
well.
mean, we are here in the middle of lot of things happening in India. So I didn't even book the flight yet. But this month we are hoping to come if things stay peaceful. We come via west, so Pacific, so that is more or less quiet.
Oh, Terry's here.
Here is Terry. Hi. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Good to see everyone.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. I see. Bill, I see you. Welcome, Terry. Good. I don't have to worry about Terry's talk. He will cover it.
Oh, well,
Otherwise, I was going to have to summarize, but this is better. That easier. Sometimes we don't finish everything in one or two synthesis sessions, so we keep writing points for the communique and we keep iterating them historically. So that
communique is next week.
yeah, what I mean is synthesis sessions lead to outline of communique sometimes,
Right, it will.
most of the times.
But we're not working on the communique this week.
No, no, no. This week and even if necessary next week, we could still be synthesizing if we have so much material that we need to. Hello, Alex. Nice to see
Alex
you.
is here. Alachan.
Yeah.
Alecan, how are
Yeah.
you?
Hi.
Very good, very good. How are you?
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
And I see Bill McCarthy. Welcome. Let us hope Mike joins because he hasn't. One of these weeks he was not
Uh,
there.
I'll formally start it soon. It's
Sure.
the intention this time to have a lot of discussion
Yes. So
about
hopefully anyone who wants to speak can they unmute themselves?
everybody can
Unmute.
speak.
Yeah.
There's no constraints this time.
Thank you.
I guess I'll start the synthesis session then.
Who is Douglas? Hi, Douglas.
Okay, Ravi, I'm going to start.
Please, please. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, to the Ontology Summit 2025. Today is the 14th of May, 2025, and we are now at our second synthesis session. Next week, we'll begin the communique. But this week, we're just going to be having a relatively open discussion. I'll start with a little introduction, then we'll just go to open discussion and try to come up with ideas for how to synthesize the wealth of material that we've had in the last two tracks 3 and 4. Hey, now here is my attempt at a topic outline. Mike Bennett began track 3 with a really excellent summary and synthesis already of his track, and to some extent even getting into track 4. So I won't attempt to repeat that here. I recommend that you look at his excellent summary on his slides. I took his concluding slide and copied it here, roughly. So what he explained was that the tracks 3 and 4 actually are going from the reality to data. The first 2 tracks were discussing conceptualization and the meaning of ontology. But how do we get from that to ontologies that are in useful applications? So the issue then is you need to represent it using data connected with reporting, queries, AI, LLMs, digital twins. And one point that Mike made was the decoupling of the ontology at one point from reality, so that we're now talking about the data, not necessarily something that is directly connected to reality. Now, I copied here the plan topics and for these 2 tracks 3 and 4, and I made a rough categorization of how we covered it. So we wanted to deal with truth makers, perception, situation awareness, and we had a number of talks on truth makers. Talks there, Hoiston Lidebo, Kit Fine. Mike Bennett then discussed truth makers, perception, and we had a nice presentation by Andrea Westernen on situation awareness. Then quality control of ontologies from the point of view of supporting theories. Elisa Kendall had a very nice talk where she covered quite a bit of that. And then Ravi discussed the physics aspect, devices for modern theoretical physics, and the kind of devices that have been developed there. And then Terry, perhaps you can come a little later and talk about perhaps how theoretical knowledge can create our measurement tools in for physical measurement. I didn't see so much about the last two plant topics. Perhaps Alex can tell us if he thought those were covered in our presentations. Then more in track 4, what is the difference between an ontology and a mathematical theory? I'm going to talk about that in the next slide.
Very
And
good.
then examples of ontologies with large amounts of instance data, the scaling up issue. Ravi talked about that, and Elisa also talked about that. And how effective are these ontologies in practical situations? And Elisa covered that, and also Alajan talking about business aspects of the use of ontologies. And do the ontologies adequately support reasoning processes? Panel discussion, we had discussed this at some length. And also the next topic, what trade-offs may have been considered. And finally, how ontologies in AI are being used for Nobel Prizes. Ravi talked about that. So I think we covered our plan topics pretty well. So then there's this question, what is the relationship between ontology and mathematics? And I gave a little table here. The purpose of an ontology, as we saw in the first track, is to conceptualize a domain. It then goes on to have other applications. Mathematics, on the other hand, just determines logical consequences of axioms. It isn't necessarily related to any domain, although it may be inspired by some domain. What are the foundations of ontology in mathematics? Ontology generally is founded by classes, relationships, and properties. Mathematics, on the other hand, generally is concerned with axioms and deductive rules as the foundational aspects of mathematical treatments, mathematical theories. The techniques that are used, well, mathematics tends to be essentially just deductive proofs and frameworks for carrying out deduction. Ontologies, on the other hand, while we use on deduction, there are other techniques that we also use, such as abduction, induction, and so on. What are the applications? Well, there's a lot of overlap in applications of mathematics and ontology. Certainly, both get used in science, engineering, business, and so on. I mentioned a few there just to sort of get the discussion going. Okay, now what were the sessions and speakers? Mike Bennett spoke at the beginning of track 3. I already mentioned that. Andrea talked about narratives to gain situation awareness for the ontologies. Alachan discussed these semantic strategies that reveal hidden insights in the business world. We then had a panel discussion that was far-ranging and I think a very useful discussion. And then Ravi talked about ontology and data. We had a very nice discussion of industrial ontology and knowledge graph development by Elisa. And finally, Terry talked about this interesting unifying physics theme using time construction, but also time and space, I would say, as they are
Yes.
intimately connected. And with that, I will stop sharing and begin the open discussion.
Well, if I can make one comment, I am, as I assume most of you know, I'm not an ontologist by training. I have much background in taxonomies from my taxonomies that often generated chaos, by the way. That was an interesting symptom of the whole XML era, is people would create these extremely detailed taxonomies, and then you start bumping them against each other, and they would just explode. So it was an interesting feature, and I think one of the reasons why the whole neural net method took off. I witnessed that transition where people were advocating the more structured approaches, but the neural nets with their sloppiness kind of won out because they actually did not suffer that same type of characters. They have their own problems. So I just found this very interesting. And I would say that reading the papers by people in this group, I really
everybody. Now we get
part. It resonated very well with me that maximizing the realism is a good way to do science and a good way to think about some of these issues. And so I appreciated the chance to find out more about ontology, and it certainly influenced my outlook. So whatever.
Well, wonderful. It
Thank
was
you.
very valuable, Terry, that you had that taxonomy background, because taxonomy and thesaurus and then vocabularies and terms are the backbones of ontologies, at least in practical applications. We use them. So your knowledge of taxonomy was not in vain. When you spoke to us, you were able to weave ontological concepts into space-time. I was very much impressed, and I hope we can touch on some of them today as well. I think what I want to react to is that Ken did such an excellent job of giving us that overview of what we have done, especially for track 3 and 4. For track 1 and 2, I think I might have been there or I might have missed the meeting. So this was very good for track 3 and 4. And that can begin. I mean, you can keep showing those slides if it helps us advance our topics for synthesis. I have a couple of points, but I'll let Larry speak if he has more to say. Or
Anyone else? Let's see.
yeah,
Barry, were you going to speak?
I see John, new John.
No, that wasn't me.
Oh, okay. Janet?
Yeah, I think we've had some very deep issues come out here that are beyond the track, that are each of them is inherently about this relationship between reality, data, and ontology. Terry's and Barry and Jobst in particular, I thought, I guess you can see these same themes throughout. There are lessons about needing to really operationalize what you're talking about and get down to the boring details, because the very word ontology is, I think, as I said before, it's a marketing term. It's unfortunate. It seems to mean more than it does. It implies that you're dealing with the structure of the world. But what does that mean? Ontology was a substitute for world models, and it was thought that it would provide clarity. But as Terry said about taxonomies, if you're not really down to the boring details of the clouds of clocks and things like that, about exactly what you're talking about in building a reference model, which is maybe a better term for what an ontology is. It's a reference model that's the use that people are going to make of it. is going to be encoded in a specification. It's going to include taxonomy and axioms for reasoning. I don't know. I've been trying to think about how to put these very deep insights that have come up, like Barry saying there's a limitation on BFO. BFO can't capture modern physics. So that's a very interesting revelation about his assumption that BFO reflected the world as it was. I think by next year, by the 20th summit, we should be able to bring these issues out. But ontology was, instead of dealing with semiotics and what does it mean to put together sign relations where you expect to get regular effects out of them. What is a sign? What is it? What's a reference? What is an interpretation? What's hermeneutics? What's epistemology, as we briefly talked about, and Todd wanted to pursue that a little bit. All of the difficult issues that are wrapped up into the O word all need to be laid out, I think, if you really want to develop the technology, ontological technology. Anyway, that's a couple of things I've been thinking about for the last few hours and trying to,
Very good.
Not much of a summary, but.
Oh, that was
Good.
very nice.
Aye.
Speaking of taxonomies, a number of years ago, I published a paper, actually, where was that? This is about taxonomies. The issue back then was, is rectangle, is square a subclass of rectangle? Or is it the other way around?
That's
Or
very
are they just independent?
true in software. It makes a
So
difference.
it gets into this, what you just said, Janet, operationalizing. By looking at thinking of classes as just being like sets, right? And the relationship is just subset relationship. You're missing the behavioral aspects. When you look at square and rectangle or ellipse and circle, from a behavioral standpoint, it's the opposite of what you'd expect. Because a rectangle has more behavior, it's actually a subclass of square. But if you look at set theoretically, it's the other way around. So it's unless you look at the operational aspects, the behavioral aspects, your taxonomy is not going to be realistic. It's not going to actually be particularly useful for applications or actually reflect reality.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful. It's the P word, the pragmatics. When Charles Morris summarized Peirce's semiotics in syntactics, semantics, pragmatics, and that was republished in the Unified Encyclopedia of Science with Carnap and Vienna Circle people. They acknowledged that pragmatics was the difficult part, where the relationships among the signs, the relationship of the signs to the reference, and then the significance, how it is going to be used, the question of what effect is intended from putting together a sign or a sign relation. That was going to be the difficult part, but they thought that semantics was worth pursuing. But but you wouldn't get all of semiotics back until you brought the pragmatics in. Now, when the whole semantic web effort started, I was surprised that they were cutting it off at semantics. And that seemed like a naive way to do it, that they thought that they could just put this sign in relation to that entity and this sign in relation to that entity, and it will all be stable, without regard for how these things are going to be used. And so these decades, now we can look back and see that if we had been looking at the use from the beginning, then I think it actually, a lot of the issues would go away if one was actually putting the full picture together with the operations. And I know we've had talks before where pragmatics keeps coming up as, oh, gee, we should reintroduce pragmatics.
So Todd, actually, let me get his questions before we go on to those who raise their hand. How does a rectangle behave? It's an interesting, when I believe it was Piaget was looking at how children learn. So you would ask a child to make a bigger square, and they would make a bigger square, expanded. You'd ask a child, okay, now here's a rectangle, make a bigger rectangle. They would make it longer. So that's something a square can't do. So this rectangle has a behavior of being lengthened that a square doesn't have. So a rectangle has more behavior, more methods from a programming point of view than a square has. And it's very real for children. This is how they conceptualize the world. They conceptualize it in terms of what they can do with objects, which had some interesting consequences when they tried to do the new math. I don't know if you've ever heard of that fiasco. Children don't think of the world in terms of sets. They think in terms of objects that they can grasp and deal with. So now, who had their hand up first? Was it Gary or?
Yes, yes, it
Jim?
was.
Gary,
So I
Yes,
raised
Gary.
my hand a long time ago to try to come back to the synthesis issue, but before I get there, since so many things have happened since, when I think about pragmatics and the reaction to the semantic web, I think of Leo Herbst, who Terry would know well from MITRE, who talked very, very early on about pragmatics. So some of us tried to redirect things early on. But coming back to the importance of the synthesis here, you had a chart comparing ontology to mathematics, and it relates to some of the things from track 1, which I was involved in. And I think it's a little bit mistaken, and at least I would argue a little bit about the table in 2 ways. So one way is that, as Barry would say, mathematics is a domain. And you can make an ontological model of mathematics with the mathematical entities. See his paper and his co-author for a big discussion of that. The second thing is his reaction to a question I asked at the end of the talk, saying that there are many other ways to look at something, which would include, in terms of models, including metaphors and quantum mechanics, etc., which has been a topic we've discussed. According to Barry's view and others, is to some extent a metaphorical look from leveraging mathematics. So there is an application there that's different, which is allowing us to sort of use some ideas in mathematics as a metaphor what is going on in the physical world. And I think if we're going to do a synthesis, those things are important. If you're going to use your diagram, there'd be some discussion around those points.
Well, let me emphasize that diagram is a first draft.
Yes, no, I
I
understand.
think we should we definitely need to work on that diagram. We have to fix that diagram. And even as I was making it, I was saying, no, this isn't quite right.
Right.
We really need to fix this. We never really did enough of this, I think, during our summit so far. It would be good to really start looking more carefully at the relationship between math and ontology. So yeah, thanks, Gary. Those are some good insights. And then can I move on now, Gary?
Sure. Got lots of hands up.
So Alachan,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So my thing was about what the Janet said. She, let's say, collected all the sides. But what I actually learned during this Ontology Summit was that there are actually two distinct, so to speak, views when it comes to the ontology development. Also affected my research, by the way, because I decided one side, so to speak. Like one is using the language, like semiotics and how we interpret the terms and so on. And the other thing is more Barry Smith's approach, where we are looking through the reality, basically, like what these terms really represents. And in my opinion, the biggest conflicts occurs because of two things, these two distinct philosophical bases. Like, for example, if we look at the UFO and like, for example, what the Guizardi shown, it was more prone to the language side, where the Barry Smith and the John Soa, in my opinion, they are more prone to the, not my opinion, but it is evidently from their papers, they are more evidently to the realistic side. And if we just took one and then developed the ontology later on, two ontologies will look really different, in my opinion. And then there will be like a crucial differences for sure. For example, the UFO and so on, they are using the multi-level theory, which we discussed with some colleagues before. And the other one, for example, will refute this so that they will not allow such modeling approaches. And in my opinion, the clarifying what type of philosophy we are using to model these ontologies plays maybe the most crucial thing that we should first define and then move on. So that was my comment about the summit myself.
Thanks, Alachan. Let's see, now we have Terry.
Okay, I actually, as the newbie ontologist, and by the way, Gary, I haven't talked to Leo in years. I don't know if you know where he is or what he's up to, but
Yes, I do.
oh,
He's very well retired in Virginia and enjoying life in the country.
excellent.
Yes.
There's some good spots.
Right.
I brought back a lot of memories just mentioning Leo. He brought
Yeah.
a lot of interesting things into MITRE, including David Deutsch. Okay, I got to talk to David Deutsch once. One of the things that struck me about researching papers from several of you here, including Barry Smith, is why do the ontologies work so very well for DNA, and yet the ones that I witnessed using XML type approaches tended to degenerate into chaos? I thought that was just fascinating. And I think there's some reasons there, but for me, I want to pose a couple of questions, and that certainly was one of them. Is I was fascinated and said, this worked. This really made an impact. And I think there's some reasons there about the nature of DNA and how DNA emerged. And there's an ancestry issue I would put up that's naturally occurring ancestry and derivation that I think probably helped reinforce the DNA terminology and the biological cellular terminology. These processes and these entities are being shared by nature and in enormous levels of sharing. And apparently that's part of where we're latching onto some of that. So I found that quite intriguing because, again, for me, from the time period where I was at, we had a lot of terminology disconnects where it tended to go into chaos. The other question came up to me, and I don't know how it's being dealt with these days, is psychological bias. Every worker has a different viewpoint. I think the example I heard someone else give once was, you go into a room, if you're an electrician, you see that room very, very differently from someone who works in just using the room, or someone who is into air conditioning. You will literally see the construction of that room in very different light. And I think that's one of the reasons where the chaos tended to emerge from some of these taxonomies we had. What we had were different people putting together the same data, but from very different perceptions of what was important. So I don't know what the current status is of ontology for dealing with that issue. It's a tricky issue, but I think we have to be very, very aware that we all have those biases. And I've seen just fascinating examples of such biases in physics, but just take your choice. That's just one example. Even in deep physics, there can be powerful biases that we don't realize. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had impediments in trying to solve some of these things. Someone mentioned the square versus the rectangle. I think that's a fascinating example. The addition of information is a theme that you also see in biology. You take a segment, replication with adaptation is a powerful theme in biology. So you have one entity, you make it two, the two stick together. Then you make it 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you start modifying little details on each one of those. You just see that theme so often in the box. What do they call them? Boxes. These genes that replicate in that fashion. So there's something. It's telling something about this idea of taking a basic and then adding information. And I don't know what the right terminology is, but one of the examples I've used several times in talking about relativistic physics is you can't truly define a Euclid's point. Euclid's first definition was a point of all things. You know, what could be simpler than a point? It doesn't work if you're in special relativity because a point then has direction. As soon as you have it moving past you, it has a length, it has an extension, and it is no longer a featureless blob. And the definition of point is really a calculus definition. You shrink down a featureless blob until it's a very small featureless blob. And yet even something as simple as Euclid's very first definition in mathematics invokes that same problem about a square versus a rectangle, because it becomes a rectangle when you move it. It becomes a squashed rectangle. But fascinating relationships going on with those. So again, those are my two main questions that came out for me is, what is the basis that makes a BFO? Oh, one other thing. I would disagree with Barry Smith. I think BFO has more relevance to physics and going down. I think I don't think it needs to be, I think there are insights there that can be pushed, but it's going to take some interesting new looks at how to do that. But I was struck when I looked at the BFO and said, this has resonances at some very deep levels. So I'm actually a little more, oddly enough, a little more optimistic that the basic formal ontology has some interesting potential. And I'll leave it at that.
So let's see, well, Alex actually has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, look, I just like to emphasize one important thing, that we should talking about formal ontologies. I mean, not only about basic formal ontology, but our task is to create not any kind of ontology, but formal one. And actually, what does it mean? It means to formalize one or another knowledge. And for example, if we take, so I have a message. No, it's good. If we take Euclid geometry, then next level of accuracy is Hilbert's axiomatic system, axiomatic theory for geometry. And then the next step is to formalize this particular theory. Because if we take Hilbert's text, it's great mathematical text, but it's not formalized. Our task is formalize theoretical and practical knowledge. This is the main point. We are not creating theories. We are just formalize these theories to use, let's say, algorithms to work with information in one or another area. Other point is that I talked about data verbalization. If we took data not separately of experience, how we get it, then we can say the same knowledge in this concentrated in this data when we say it by words. It's very important because if we take data itself, we can't be sure we understand what does it mean. Then we need to ask, if I give you some data, the first question is, what does it mean? And this meaning came with words. And these words are from theory. This is like triangle if you need it. Okay, that's my point.
Okay, and now I think Ravi, you're next. You're muted. Ravi?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it enough volume?
Yes, it's fine.
Quick response or comment on the two colleagues, Terry and Alex. Terry, I will come back to Euclid in a minute, okay? And Alex, yes, the various technologies we have studied over last 2-3 summits in 2-3 years include data to speech, kind of indirectly, because we have talked a lot about graphs. So data to visualization we have talked, but data to speech is a good concept. That is an intermediate concept that will take us to data to information. And it's the collection of information that is subject to reasoning. And reasoning is what ontologies, accuracies are related. So this is one comment I wanted to make. But let me recall what I wanted to say for track 4, which I chaired. I want to bring in yet another viewpoint, something that Corey Casanova is used to bringing in model-driven architectures. We talked about mathematics and relevance of mathematics to ontologies, and Ken's last slide on that subject amplified that, if you remember, right in the beginning. Now I want to say mathematics has a concept of reality depiction by mathematics a certain way. And another way is for physics to do some kind of models and bring reality into their modeling regime. What about the ontology between these two? Nobody has talked. I'm talking for the first time that we should think of an ontology between mathematics and physics at a given level. If I have a model which has a convergence and divergence in physics, how much of mathematics can approximate it and when does it become divergent? When I have a mathematical model that describes geometric concepts like point or area or volume, how much of physics can be corroborated when we are especially at boundary crossings, phase transitions, processes, transitions, etc. So the mathematics and physics connection ontology will one day prove to be very beneficial. I stop at that point now. Next, I go to one more point which was made here, and Elisa Kendall's data on EDM, ISO standards, pharma, and finance. Some of these are also touched by Mike Bennett, as you know. So this is one point which I just leave out, but she did tell us about huge ontology and data integration efforts, exemplifying it through EDM and ISO, other standards, but she did bring it. Now we come to the last 2 points. One relates to neurotransformers. We talked of neurosymbolic AI last year, and deep neural networks, and AI ontology summits. So when we go beyond standard model, we use deep neural networks and transformers. And so I just wanted to give one example of CERN using for these very large databases and their huge data sets. They use XGB boost, cat boost, and random forest kind of algorithms, which are AI based, and they help you identify certain resonances that are short-lived. And I'm talking obviously of particle physics right now. So that was one point I wanted to bring. Now I will finally come to Terry's point. Terry, there were two things that you were emphasizing that I remembered, although there are like 15 things you talked about, and it's very wide knowledge, but I concentrate on two. One is affine transformations. So if you don't get stuck on Euclidean space alone and allow monads and affine transformations, you are able to correlate the origins of different spatial dimensions, which you had difficulty when you tried to put Einstein's point with a moving frame of reference being derived from master frame to secondary frame through acceleration. I understand, and I think time measurement, as you illustrated in your talk, through that is a great eye-opener, that there are hidden things within internals of what we assume to be good physics, that those internal details can cause space-time contractions or differentiations of types. I agree, but affine transformation is one. I also want us to consider time as one entity and space as another. And suppose we forget Minkowski or the spatial relativity connection between the two and deal with the tensorial formalism of general relativity as dealing with just spatial, say, coordinates, and treat time differently. How? Don't ask me today, but maybe tomorrow. But if we do that, then maybe in some higher dimension, time does enter, and physicists are talking. Some are talking of 11th dimension, some are talking of 14th dimension when our time enters. But time could be a different kind of beast in the end, or different kind of entity that does not conform to just always mixing with space. I would love to get your perspective, Terry, and everybody else's perspective. I think I'm going to stop at this today because I have spoken enough. Ken, would you like Terry to respond, or would Janet go?
Janet has her hand up.
Okay.
Unless Terry wants to respond while that's fresh.
I can respond to that. I have some notes on what he has, so I can talk to it a little bit later.
Okay.
I think Robbie and I will need to have an offline chat and get really deep in some physics.
Yes, I knew that. almost knew that. Thank you.
Read on this one,
Janet.
Okay. So the issue is not that formal ontology isn't feasible. It's that it's misconceived if it is only dealing with semantics rather than pragmatics. The reason an electrician goes into a room and sees it differently from the housekeeper is because they operate differently in the room. And so what they see is a function of how they operate. And that's how you can ground the room. There's no common sense interpretation of the room. There's no reality that we just reflect in one model. There's the electrician's view of it, and we can use the architecture metaphor. There's a viewpoint of electrician, a viewpoint of a housekeeper, a viewpoint of the caterer, a viewpoint of the all the meeting, the people sitting at a conference table. Everybody is interacting with the world differently, depending on their their operations. That's where the stability is, not in the idea that there's a reality of the room that is that we can look at without the perspectives of the participants and have some common sense definition of what the room is. That's the part that's it's a misdirection, and it's a waste of time to try to take the people and the uses out of the picture and simplify reality. And that's my objection to Barry's assumptions. So Gary pointed out that so mathematics is a domain. I just think that Barry and Jobst's insights about how one needs to be more, one can't make the simplifying assumptions that he makes for BFO when one gets to modern physics. Then one needs to be careful about saying, here are the physicists are using the mathematics to operate and get a result. And, so that's the quantum theory, the mathematics of modern physics is operational. It doesn't have a referent in a common sense world, but it is something that people use. So it's something that people use successfully, and it's the successful use that grounds it. That's the stable part that really should be carried throughout. So throughout of all of this ontology development is who is using this for what. So DNA is used by nature. DNA is repeatedly used by nature, so it's stable. So I'm optimistic about the future of formal ontology, but surfacing assumptions about what is obvious and what is common sense and what is reality, that's where one needs to, that's where one can get a lesson from Terry, from your presentation, and from Barry's and Jobst's presentation, is that there are so many assumptions built into Newtonian mechanics. You have the Euclidean space and homogeneous time. It's folded in. Hilbert suggested to Minkowski, just fold this in, and then it looks, on the surface, it looks like you're not dealing with assumptions, but you're always dealing with assumptions, and surfacing assumptions should be part of what ontology is all about.
Well, there's one way to look at how you distinguish between kind of different viewpoints is through the notion of situation, which is something that I've talked about a number of times, and Andrea gave a nice presentation on situation awareness. So I think we have covered that pretty well. That doesn't mean that the notion of situation is, absolutely well understood and complete. I mean, it's still something that could be worked on. But from the point of view of our communique, we should look at what Andrea has presented to us and kind of synthesize that and summarize it.
Yeah.
And give our point of view of where, what areas are still in need of work, where, what action items do we feel are important for our community?
One quick response to what Janet just said, just half a minute or less, is that when we cross domains, that is where challenges occur. Our vocabularies have to be tweaked. Our notions of what is valid in one has to be revalidated in the other. And healthcare transition all the way from medicine to clinical to surgical to post-operative rehab, whatever stages we go through, different ontology aspects of different domains interplay. And we have not yet come of age when our ontologies transition dynamically to handle all these operational requirements and scenarios. Certainly, knowledge graphs, Sparkle languages, LLMs, AI are taking us there, and we will reach there. Thank you.
Okay, so Terry, you still have your hand up?
Yes. First, I just want to say I like Janet. I like what you said about information relationships. Where I wound up with on my little physics explorations is, to my surprise, the incredible importance of information. I've never been one who liked the idea of reality as a simulation. I think that's just dumb because it ignores all capacity issues. It's just a fantasy people have. But nonetheless, when we're talking about classical physics, you just cannot get away from information. Information constantly reasserts itself, forms it, coerces it into a structure that is useful and is what we think of as classical. Take away that enforcing action of information, you get things like quantum entanglement. And there's a very tight relationship between those. Most of the time, we're very classical because we're all observing everything all the time, constantly at every level. It's not a conscious observer thing. It's just anything that bumps is something else, and as that observes it. But the collective action of that is incredibly information rich and formative. And this is one of the reasons why I think the idea of a formal ontology can be extended downwards in some ways to address that. If you get that distinction between, you have to start breaking it apart. Some of the things that we think of as persistent particles, for instance, they're actually processes. And I think I've given too many presentations lately. I believe I gave it as an example that when you see a particle going through a cloud chamber, every time you get a little cloud particle, you've observed the electron. And to think that's the same thing as an electron going through a vacuum is experimentally incorrect, because an electron going through a vacuum will reflect. The electron going through the cloud chamber will never reflect. They are very, very different at a phenomenological level. And yet it's so intuitive to us because that's how we work. That's our classical world. We don't see that. So I think if we break through that little barrier, and this gets that thing about the distinction about quantum mechanics, the fact that quantum mechanics doesn't deal with information is critical for understanding how ontologies work at a deeper level. Somehow that quantum side is the interface to a universe that has change and it has distance. But neither of those are the change or the distance that we think of with clocks and rulers. Clocks and rulers only exist with fermionic matter. Change and distance, and no one has quantified this, but I've made some attempts at the very least, the separations are the square of what we think they are. So they're not at all like what we think. But I think there's progress possible in some of those directions. So relationships of information is getting back to what Janice said. That's why I think relationships of information are incredibly important for getting well grounded into levels that change less. And I don't think it always has to have a human involved with that. Some of these relationships are at a very fundamental level between particles. There's a relationship between an electron and a proton. It's a very tight relationship, and the result is an atom. And that atom doesn't need us to persist. Its location needs us to persist, but not the atom. And those kind of relationships are powerful, and they go deep. So I think we get into mathematics. As I said in presentation, we are using 1700s mathematics with, as Janet said, perfect Euclidean space, infinite in size, zero cost for bringing in gazillion different things into the same thing, even for a silly block sphere. which shouldn't have all that much information in it. So why are we so sloppy with information? Why do we treat it like it's just free? And the reason is because we're using 1700s maths. And we need to be cautious about that. These maths are incredibly powerful, but they also need to be constrained. Casimir, in one of his comments towards the end of his life, he said two things in the same talk that I thought was fascinating. The Casimir effect absolutely is real, and there's good experimental evidence for that. And it is extremely weak and determined by how much energy you put into the system to begin with, which then binds it to matter. That is not what you hear in the less casual uses of the mathematics, where they just ascribe infinite energy, infinite information, infinite everything to every part of space. That's not what Casimir saw, and he noticed that yeah, this is real, but only within the limits of what you charge it up with. And that's a very different view of the universe. So, and at this point, I think I'm wandering or getting off my own little thing, but information relationships, important perspectives, human, sometimes not human, but anytime we can address relationships that persist and show up, I think that adds more durability to the resulting ontological structure.
Can I clarify about
Thank
the
you.
human, the role of the human?
Thank you.
That it's in the automated systems, of course, you are thinking in terms of the reasoning is by an agent. And it's helpfully anthropomorphized. Every time you have an interaction, it's helpfully seen as being an agent who is responding to a signal and reasoning or doing whatever, transforming. So it's not so much the human per se, but it's that user. The automated agent is a user of the information in the system. So that's where the pragmatics needs to go through from end to end. We're the humans doing the development. We understand how we operate in the world. We're anthropomorphizing the systems so that we can figure out how they should interact with each other. And as you're saying, throughout down to the quantum level too.
Well, in fact, at the quantum level, the pragmatics you just described bear remarkable resemblance to the idea of wave collapse, the idea that you're, after a certain point, it becomes stabilized. Again, the electron example. So, and that's the part I think we're not capturing real well, because quantum mechanics has gotten off in this philosophical tirade about Schrodinger or cats being real. I just saw a little YouTube video, I think the Science Asylum, whatever it was, but it'd be one of the best ones I've seen in a long time. Schrodinger intended that as a ridiculous example. And to have decades, a century of people going on and on about, oh, this is how reality is really, what? Everywhere, everything at once, as in the movie, is never what was intended, is never what is observed experimentally, with incredible emphasis on that point. This is not what we see experimentally. We do see ambiguity about location, but people just instantly blur that into everything. So we have to be careful when our mathematics are incomplete. And the mathematics of Minkowski, Ravi, one of my problems with Ravi with Minkowski is he never bothered with origins. He never bothered with terminations. He loved the middle. He's the guy to get the good part of the whatever was the dessert, just left the edges off and didn't bother with that. And you can't do that. You can't do that. That's why we've had trouble with twins paradoxes for a century. Now, Einstein has to take some credit for that too, but his was just a little math error. Minkowski just loved it. He just dove into it. Eventually, Einstein dove in with him. But mathematics that don't cover the full structure are inherently not realist mathematics. And mathematics need to be realist. They need to attach. And if you say, well, no, we're pure. No, you're not. You're based on 1700s concepts that only apply to an unmoving single frame inertial frame system. That's a lot of assumptions to cram into what you're saying is more fundamental.
Perhaps
Thanks,
we
thanks, Terry,
need
but
a separate
we really should
session.
get back to the main
We need,
topic of
yeah,
our session,
right,
which is the synthesis.
yes.
Um,
Terry
Gary has made a
Todd,
number of,
Todd has some comment.
Gary actually has a number of posts and Todd responded to them. And I think we should, we should be, I mean, I know we've run out of time. Gary, could you comment a little on what you've posted? You're muted.
Hopefully the posting will be useful for people thinking about synthesis. As you know, I'm taking my perspective from track one and wondering how to incorporate some of the things from there in the later sessions. I think Barry is very useful there, but I think that we have a lot to say about, we should say in this communique, eventually synthesized message, we should say something about the methods of ontology that can deal with some of these issues, at least as well as anybody. It's an interdisciplinary area, so ontology doesn't exist by itself. There are knowledge engineers, anthropologists, linguists, and so forth that we collaborate with. I think that's an important point that's been made. I think the role of unpacking things, that is thinking more deeply about things before you axiomatize things, is very important. And challenges exist when you're trying to cross domains where two different domains have to talk to each other to interpret what they are. And so I think our synthesis need to say something about that. How the tracks other than track one address that is not, it's not something I'm a master of, but I certainly would try to help with that.
Hey, Kenneth,
Todd,
one
ahead,
last
Todd.
thought. One last thought. I think we should go back and revisit what Elisa had to tell us from the practical perspective in terms of formalization, because she did allude to some of the aspects that Gary had just been mentioning, with regard to interoperability and performance and so on. So no matter what assumptions you want to make, if you want to get paid, you got to get something working. And then there are requirements that you need to conform to, and decisions you have to make, and assumptions that you may have to validate or invalidate, or you have to make in order to get your result to actually do what you want it to do. That's all.
Could you post that? Write it
In what
down.
fashion?
Get it
Well, I
in
can
writing,
copy it
please.
from the transcript.
Could you do that
Okay.
rather than forcing me to extract it from the transcript?
Well, copy and paste is easy.
What is it?
Copy and paste is easy, which I just did.
Great. That's good. Excellent. Thank you. So hopefully that will
And
capture.
I'm sorry, one last thought, Kenneth. Barry Smith's name has come up many times during these conversations and his presentation. And one thing I want to point out, I have been listening to Barry and working with him for some time over the decades, and his perspective on how BFO can be used and the assumptions that it makes, and in particular, the labels that are used in it, those symbols, as Janet refers to them, his view on those things have been changing. So we need to keep that in mind. He understands that BFO has limitations, as he pointed out, but I also have noticed that his, shall we say, sensitivity to the use of the labels that are used in the ontology has been changing also. For some time, he sort of ignored those, but he's coming to realize that they are important because the ontologies that we're developing are acting as interfaces between humans and machines and machines and machines. So if we want to be able to interface with these machines in an intelligent and useful way, then we have to be concerned about the linguistics, i.e. the labels and symbols that we use.
Really good point. Gary?
Yeah, I have
Also,
my
we
hand
could,
up because I
somewhere-
wanted to ask
yeah.
before we leave how we're going to do the next meeting and what people need to do to prepare for the next meeting so we can be working on a communique.
Well, thanks. That's good. I was thinking we would be doing this at the next meeting, but sure, if you want to talk about it now.
Have we,
Great.
well, have we learned any lessons about what is useful? Are there assignments that people are going to take on to sort of try to build on what we've talked about here?
That
Well,
would be-
certainly the track people have their responsibilities to put something up to Ken to consider for whether it is relevant for communique. Communique is little more formal document than conversational, so we have to communicate in that language.
So do we agree with the high-level description of the summit's topic that was on our website and try to point things at how we are addressing those issues?
I
Conceptualization,
think only partially. Yes.
analysis, axiomization.
We have veered off main topic of conceptualization, certainly in tracks 3 and 4, and I don't know about 2, but we have more or less kept in focus always the concepts of like math and ontology and formalization. Yes, but we have also gone into areas of AI and science and physics. And it would not be out of way here to mention that John Sova's approach is different, and his and Majumdar's talk was very illustrative of how you can use IT assets and large language models to bring cognitive decisions by reducing human effort and automating it intelligently.
Oh, no.
So, yes.
It is a fact that a wonderful, pure, beautiful theory, as soon as you start trying to apply it to real world, it can get, you suddenly discover, oh, things are a lot more messy in the real world.
Or as some
Yes.
of us say, squares become rectangles.
That's right. Like the joke that went back when I was in grad school
Good one.
in mathematics, this wonderful mathematician was tasked with handling a real world problem, and he begins his talk with a concern with a disease among cattle. Said, okay, let's consider a spherical cow. That's when a very beautiful ontology meets the real world, things start to get messy, right? And they should. And maybe we shouldn't try to kind of whitewash that.
No, that's why Elisa's talk and also Elegance to some extent were very practical, real things. Barry also brought it in physics quite deeply. So these are examples we will use in the communique.
And Terry's talk.
Gary's, yes.
Terry, you were also making a big point about that. So, all right, are we going to allocate tasks now, or should we wait until next week?
Next week is appropriate time, I think.
Okay, I mean, we've run over, and I think next week we will be switching to attention a little bit. We're going to talk about the communique, asking our volunteers to work on different aspects of it. So that's going to be rather different from what we did today. But thanks everyone for contributing today. I think we had a very nice,
Thank you, Ken.
interesting
And others.
synthesis session.
Eddie and other guests.
Yeah.
Very, very, very happy to see you all.
And
you.
I invite you, everyone to come next week as we begin working on the actual communique, which will involve asking for volunteers, as I said, and putting together a formal document for publication.
If I can
So
mention quickly, I think I have a copy of the total comments up to the last one. So if somebody can tell me where to send that, I'll send a Word copy of all those comments.
You can send us to me and Ken, or just to Ken.
you can send it, yeah,
Right.
send it to me. Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
And with that, we will adjourn today and hope to see everyone next week.
Thank you.